I kind of like Diddy.
You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country. Second, I bought up every potential post-release business deal he had lined up. I planned this 2 years in advance, so by the time he got sentenced and still had hope of getting out, every partner had already cut ties with him. Third, I don't just have evidence, I've got backups. This is an entire minefield that's been buried for 20 years. I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. With testimonies from the victims, we interviewed over a dozen people he tricked, threatened, or violated. You think that's harsh? No, he destroyed other people's lives for decades. I'm just making sure he spends a few extra years in prison for it. I'm not afraid of his people, not afraid of his threats. I know he's still in there fantasizing about a comeback, but the truth is, he's never coming back.
People keep calling this a beef, a rivalry, an ego clash, a personal issue. But if you actually slow down and observe how both of them move, something becomes very clear. This was never emotional, and it was never personal. It was psychological. Because personal beefs explode. They escalate fast. They burn hot and burn out. This never did. What you're watching here is not anger colliding with anger. It's 2 completely different mindsets existing in the same space, operating under very different rules. And psychology is always revealed through behavior, not words. 50 Cent and Diddy don't react the way rivals usually do. They don't confront. They don't clarify. They don't try to win publicly. Instead, they circle each other in silence and humor. That alone tells you this isn't about feelings. This is about control. And 50 Cent's psychology is built around survival, street logic, pattern recognition, pressure without exposure. Diddy's psychology is built around power, access, influence, authority without explanation. Those 2 mindsets don't crash loudly. They test each other quietly. And when you understand that, everything starts to make sense. Because emotionally driven people overreact. Psychologically driven people wait. They observe. They measure. They choose moments carefully. That's why this dynamic feels different from normal celebrity conflicts. There's no chaos here. No spiraling. No loss of control. Just restraint. And restraint is not weakness. Restraint is awareness. Before we go deeper, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss videos like this. Now let's get back. The biggest mistake people make is assuming silence means nothing is happening. In psychology, silence is rarely empty. It's loaded. When someone has nothing to lose, they talk freely. When someone has everything to lose, they choose words carefully, or not at all. That's why this situation never becomes direct. Direct conflict would expose intentions. And exposure weakens both sides. So instead, each side stays inside their comfort zone. 50 Cent stays in humor, timing, and indirect pressure. Diddy stays in silence, distance, and authority. Neither breaks character. That's not coincidence. That's self-awareness. Psychology isn't about what people say. It's about what they avoid. And both of them avoid escalation like it's radioactive. Why? Because escalation forces answers, and answers create consequences. This is why the internet feels confused about this dynamic. People want statements. They want explanations. They want a winner. But psychology doesn't work like that. Psychology works in patterns. Who speaks first? Who stays quiet? Who jokes? Who ignores? Those choices reveal more than any interview ever could. And when you analyze those choices, one thing becomes obvious. Both men understand exactly who they're dealing with. That's why there's no chaos. That's why there's no explosion. That's why this has lasted years without resolution. Because psychologically, both sides are playing defense, not offense. Defense of image, defense of control, defense of position. This isn't about proving anything. It's about maintaining balance. And once you realize that this is a psychological standoff, not a personal feud, you stop asking the wrong questions. You stop asking who's right, and you start asking something much more interesting. Who benefits from staying exactly where they are? Because in psychology, the person who doesn't move is often the one who feels safest. And that tells you everything you need to know about why this dynamic has never turned into a real war. Not because it couldn't, but because neither side can afford to lose control. To really understand this psychology, you have to strip away the fame and look at how 50 Cent's mind actually works. Because his behavior didn't start in the industry. It started long before that. 50 Cent comes from an environment where saying the wrong thing once can change everything, where reactions matter more than intentions, where survival depends on reading people before they speak. That kind of background rewires how you think. You don't rush, you don't overreact, and you never show your full hand. That's why his moves never feel emotional. When people expect anger, he laughs. When people expect explanations, he goes quiet. When people expect escalation, he waits. That's not trolling for attention. That's psychological discipline. 50 Cent understands leverage. He knows that power doesn't always come from being loud. Sometimes it comes from being unpredictable but consistent at the same time. Consistent in tone, consistent in restraint, consistent in never crossing certain lines. This is why his humor feels different from most celebrities. It's not reckless, it's controlled. He uses humor as a buffer between himself and consequence, a way to apply pressure without triggering defense mechanisms. Because the moment someone feels attacked, they defend, and defense shifts the focus. 50 Cent doesn't want the focus shifted. He wants it suspended. Suspended in curiosity, suspended in discomfort, suspended in silence. That's a psychological tactic. He also understands audience psychology better than most. People don't remember statements. They remember moments. A joke placed at the right time sticks longer than a serious explanation ever could. That's why he never explains his intent. Explanation ends interpretation, and interpretation is where influence lives. Another key part of his psychology is patience. He's comfortable letting things sit unresolved. He doesn't need closure. People who need closure usually act impulsively. People who don't need it can wait indefinitely. That patience gives him an advantage. Because while others burn energy reacting, he conserves it. And conserving energy is a survival instinct. You can see this in how rarely he responds immediately. He watches how people react first. He lets narratives form. Then he decides if he needs to do anything at all. Most of the time he doesn't, because silence after a joke is just as powerful as the joke itself. It forces others to fill the gap. And once others start filling the gap, control shifts away from the speaker. That's intentional. 50 Cent doesn't need to dominate conversations. He needs to influence them. There's also a deep awareness of consequence in how he operates. He knows exactly what lines not to cross. He knows what triggers legal reactions. He knows what forces public responses, and he stays just outside those zones. That's not fear, that's calculation. People often confuse calculation with cowardice, but psychologically it's the opposite. It's confidence in your ability to control outcomes without force. This is why his approach works so well against powerful figures. Power expects confrontation. It's prepared for accusations. What it's not prepared for is subtlety, because subtlety doesn't give power anything to push back against. And 50 Cent lives in that space, not loud enough to be challenged, not silent enough to be ignored, just present enough to be felt. That's his psychology, and once you understand that mindset, you realize something important. This isn't about Diddy specifically. It's about how 50 Cent navigates any situation where power, silence, and reputation collide. Diddy just happens to be the clearest example of that psychology in action. And that sets the stage for understanding the other side of this dynamic. Because when two psychologically disciplined minds meet, the conflict doesn't explode. It stabilizes. And that's exactly what you've been watching all along. To balance that psychology, you have to understand the other side of the equation. Because Diddy's mindset is built very differently. Where 50 Cent comes from survival, Diddy comes from construction, building systems, building influence, building rooms that matter more than stages. His psychology isn't reactive, it's positional. Diddy doesn't need to speak often because his position speaks for him. When you control access, you don't chase attention. Attention comes to you. That's a key difference. People with influence talk. People with control don't have to. And Diddy has always operated from a place where silence increases authority. When someone like that responds publicly, It lowers their position. It puts them on the same level as the noise. So psychologically, not responding isn't avoidance. It's maintenance. Maintenance of image, maintenance of hierarchy, maintenance of distance. This is why his silence never feels panicked. There's no urgency in it, no rush to correct narratives. Urgency signals weakness. Calm signals confidence. And confidence is the currency of power. Diddy's psychology is rooted in the idea that perception matters more than explanation. If you explain yourself, you invite judgment. If you stay silent, people project strength onto you. That projection works in his favor. Artists around him understand this instinctively. They mirror the behavior. They stay respectful. They stay vague, not because they're told to, because they're reading the room. And reading the room is everything in power spaces. This is also why Diddy rarely engages in humor-based exchanges. Humor invites equality. It puts everyone on the same level. Power avoids equality. By not engaging, he keeps the hierarchy intact. 50 Cent jokes. Diddy stays still. Psychologically, that contrast is intentional on both sides. One uses movement to influence. The other uses stillness to control. Neither is accidental. Another important layer is reputation management. Diddy understands that reputations aren't defended in public. They're protected through consistency. As long as he doesn't react, the system around him continues to function normally. Deals don't stop. Rooms stay open. Access remains unchanged. That's success in his framework. From his psychological perspective, engaging with trolling would only create instability. And instability is dangerous for people who sit at the center of systems. So silence becomes the safest move. Not silence because there's nothing to say. Silence because saying anything creates risk. That's a disciplined mindset. It takes restraint to not respond when provoked, especially publicly. But restraint is a learned skill in environments where power is fragile. The higher you are, the less you move. That's the psychology at play. Diddy isn't trying to win an argument. He's trying to keep the structure intact. And as long as the structure remains intact, individual moments don't matter. Jokes pass, conversations fade, but the position stays. That's why this dynamic never escalates. Both sides are acting rationally within their own psychological frameworks. 50 Cent applies pressure without exposure. Diddy absorbs pressure without reaction. Neither breaks character. And when neither side breaks character, conflict turns into something else. A standoff. Not loud, not dramatic. Just two mindsets maintaining their ground in completely different ways. That's why this has never turned into a real clash. Because psychologically, both sides are already winning in the way that matters most to them. And that understanding is what makes this dynamic so fascinating. Not because of what's said, but because of what's intentionally left unsaid. When you put these two psychologies side by side, the real difference becomes obvious. This isn't ego versus ego. It's control versus influence. Diddy's psychology is built around control. Control of access, control of rooms, control of who gets close and who stays outside. 50 Cent's psychology is built around influence. Influence over culture, influence over conversation, influence over how people interpret moments. Control works quietly, influence works publicly. That's why they move the way they do. Control doesn't need attention. In fact, attention can weaken it. Influence needs circulation. It needs moments to travel. It needs people talking, replaying, remembering. This is why their strategies never collide directly. They operate in different arenas. Diddy doesn't chase public narratives because public narratives don't threaten his position. His power exists behind the scenes where decisions are made without cameras. 50 Cent, on the other hand, thrives in the public eye. He understands how culture moves, how jokes spread, how timing shapes perception. So instead of challenging control directly, he influences how people see it. That's a crucial psychological distinction. People who want control silence conversations. People who want influence guide conversations. And both approaches are effective in different ways. This is also why neither side escalates. Escalation would blur those boundaries. If Diddy responded publicly, he'd step into the influence arena. If 50 Cent accused directly, he'd step into the control arena. Both would lose their advantage. so they stay where they're strongest. Psychologically, this creates a stalemate, not because either side is afraid, but because both sides understand the cost of crossing over. Another important detail is how each side measures success. Diddy measures success by stability. As long as systems continue working, he's winning. 50 Cent measures success by impact. As long as moments land and linger, he's winning. Those goals don't conflict. They coexist. That's why you don't see explosive reactions. You see consistency. Consistency is the tell. Emotional conflicts fluctuate. Psychological conflicts stay steady. This dynamic has remained steady for years. Same tone, same restraint, same unspoken rules. That tells you this is intentional on both sides. Influence pokes, control absorbs, neither collapses, and that balance is what makes this so fascinating. Because influence without control can become noise. Control without influence can become invisible. Together, they create tension without resolution, and tension keeps people watching. That's why this story doesn't end. It doesn't need an ending. It exists in the space between laughter and silence, between a joke that spreads and a silence that refuses to break. Once you understand the psychological difference between control and influence, you stop expecting a blow-up. You realize there's nothing to blow up. Both sides are doing exactly what their psychology demands. Protect position, protect perception, and as long as those two goals remain intact, this dynamic will continue exactly as it is. Quiet, calculated, and far more revealing than any public argument could ever be. At the center of all this is something most people misunderstand completely: humor versus silence. People assume humor is weak and silence is strength, but psychologically both are tools. And in this dynamic, they are being used with precision. Humor lowers defenses. When someone jokes, the brain relaxes. Critical thinking slows down. Emotion softens. That's why humor is dangerous when it's intentional. A joke can say things a statement never could. It slips past resistance. It lands before people realize they're processing something serious. 50 Cent uses humor to stay mobile. He can move in and out of conversations without being trapped by them. If pushed, it's a joke. If ignored, it still circulates. If replayed, it gains weight. That flexibility is psychological power. Silence, on the other hand, does the opposite. Silence creates projection. When nothing is said, people fill the gap themselves. They assume confidence. They assume control. They assume authority. Diddy's silence forces others to guess, and guessing keeps hierarchy intact, because when people are guessing, they're not challenging. That's why silence works so well for people in powerful positions. It removes them from debate. Debate creates equality. Silence preserves distance. This is why these two tools never clash directly. Humor invites engagement. Silence refuses it. Psychologically, that creates a loop. The joke spreads. The silence absorbs it. The absence of response makes the joke feel heavier. The heavier the joke feels, the more people replay it, and the cycle continues. Neither side needs to escalate because the loop sustains itself. This is also why nothing ever gets clarified. Clarification would break the loop. If 50 Cent explained himself, humor would die. If Diddy responded, silence would lose power. So both avoid clarity, not because they're confused, but because clarity weakens their position. That's high-level psychological awareness. Most people crave being understood. Psychologically disciplined people are comfortable being misinterpreted. Misinterpretation keeps attention alive, and attention, when controlled, is influence. Another important detail is emotional control. You never see emotional reactions here. No anger, no defensiveness, no desperation. Emotion leaks information, and both sides are careful not to leak. That's why this dynamic feels cold, not heated. Cold conflicts last longer. They don't exhaust themselves. They don't explode. They don't resolve. They just continue. This is why viewers feel unsettled by it. There's no emotional payoff, no winner, no closure, just tension. And tension keeps the brain engaged. Your mind keeps trying to resolve something that refuses to resolve. That's psychology at work. So when you see humor and silence in this context, don't mistake them for personality traits. They're strategies. One spreads ideas without ownership. The other blocks accountability without explanation. Both are effective. Both are intentional. And as long as both sides keep choosing these tools over confrontation, this dynamic will remain exactly where it is. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly psychological. And that makes it far more powerful than any public feud ever could be. Timing is where psychology becomes visible. Because timing is never emotional. It's calculated. If this was personal, reactions would be immediate, fast, uncontrolled. But that's never what happens. 50 Cent waits, not because he's unsure, because he's aware. He understands that moments have emotional temperature. And messages only work when the temperature is right. Say something too early, and it gets lost in noise. Say something too late, and it feels irrelevant. So he moves in the middle, when curiosity has already formed, when silence is already noticeable, when people are already watching. That's patience, and patience is a psychological advantage. Most people feel pressure to respond, pressure to clarify, pressure to defend. People who feel pressure usually act from insecurity. 50 Cent doesn't. He's comfortable letting moments sit unresolved, because unresolved moments keep attention alive. Diddy's patience works differently. He doesn't wait to speak, he waits for things to pass. That's an important distinction. He understands that most storms burn themselves out, that attention fades if it isn't fed, that silence shortens the life of controversy. So instead of reacting, he absorbs time. Time does the work for him. People move on, headlines change, focus shifts. That's patience rooted in position. Both men are patient, but for different reasons. 50 Cent waits to strike moments. Diddy waits to outlast them. And psychologically, that tells you everything about how they see the world. One sees time as an opportunity. The other sees time as protection. This is why nothing ever feels rushed. Rushed behavior signals loss of control. Calm behavior signals confidence. Neither side ever looks rushed. And that's why escalation never happens. Escalation usually comes from impatience, from the need to resolve tension quickly. Here, tension is allowed to exist. It's not solved, it's managed. And managing tension is a high-level psychological skill. Another thing patience does is expose desperation. Whoever breaks first reveals the most, so neither side breaks. 50 Cent doesn't push until forced. Diddy doesn't respond unless necessary. They both understand that reacting gives information, and information is power. That's why this dynamic feels frozen in time. Years pass, moments repeat, patterns stay intact. That consistency is the result of patience on both sides. Not avoidance, not fear, control. When you watch this through a psychological lens, you realize something important. Neither man is trying to end this dynamic, because ending it would require clarity, and clarity would cost them something. So instead, they let it exist, quietly, safely, indefinitely. And that's why patience is the most revealing part of this story, because impatient people expose themselves. Patient people expose patterns, and patterns tell the truth long after words are forgotten. There's another layer here that most people overlook. Fear and respect don't behave the same way psychologically. Fear makes people loud, defensive, reactive. Respect makes people quiet, measured, careful. When you watch how people move around both of these figures, you don't see panic. You see caution. That's important. Artists don't rush to comment. Interviewers soften their questions. Conversations change tone when certain names are mentioned. That's not fear in the dramatic sense. That's awareness. Awareness of power, awareness of consequences, awareness of who controls what. Psychologically, this creates pressure without force. No one has to threaten anyone. No one has to say anything directly. People adjust on their own. That's the most effective kind of influence. 50 Cent understands this dynamic deeply. He knows that when you operate in a system, the system reacts before individuals do. People don't need instructions. They read signals. So when he jokes, he's not testing Diddy. He's testing the room. And the room responds. You can see it in the pauses, in the laughs that feel slightly nervous, in the way conversations shift immediately afterward. Those micro reactions reveal psychology better than any statement ever could. Diddy's presence creates a different kind of pressure, not pressure to speak, pressure to behave. When someone holds long-term power, people instinctively self-regulate around them. They don't want to offend. They don't want to misstep. They don't want to be remembered the wrong way. That's not intimidation. That's hierarchy. And hierarchy doesn't need enforcement when everyone already understands it. This is why artists don't openly choose sides, not because they're scared of conflict, because conflict threatens access. Access to rooms, access to opportunities, access to stability. Psychologically, people will protect access before they protect truth. That's human nature. This is also why you never see emotional reactions from either side. Emotion breaks hierarchy. Emotion makes you look reactive. Both men understand that losing emotional control weakens perception, so they remain composed. 50 Cent stays amused, Diddy stays distant. Both positions communicate strength in different ways, and people around them adjust accordingly. That adjustment is the real story, not the jokes, not the silence, the behavior of everyone else. Because psychology isn't just about individuals. It's about how individuals shape environments. And in this environment, respect is shown through restraint. No one oversteps. No one forces clarity. No one demands answers. They wait. That waiting tells you how much weight both figures carry. This isn't about fear of backlash. It's about understanding power structures. And once you see that, you realize something important. The tension here isn't coming from conflict. It's coming from mutual recognition. Both sides know the other is disciplined. Both sides know escalation would be costly. Both sides know the system would react. So instead of clashing, they coexist in pressure. Quiet pressure, sustained pressure, the kind that doesn't explode, but never fully disappears. And that's why this dynamic feels heavy without ever becoming loud. Because psychologically, everyone involved understands exactly how much is at stake, even when nothing is being said at all. One of the most powerful forces in this entire dynamic isn't either of them. It's the audience. Because psychology doesn't stop with the people involved. It multiplies through observation. Once viewers start noticing patterns, the story no longer belongs to the individuals. It belongs to perception. People replay moments. They slow things down. They compare timelines. Not because they were told to, but because unresolved behavior demands interpretation. That's how the internet works psychologically. When there's no clear answer, the brain keeps searching. And this situation is full of unanswered space. 50 Cent never explains. Diddy never responds. So the audience fills the gap. They connect dots. They revisit old clips. They reinterpret jokes that once felt harmless. And over time, something interesting happens. The meaning doesn't come from new information. It comes from repetition. The same behavior, seen again and again, becomes a signal. That's why this dynamic has such high replay value. People don't rewatch to be entertained. They rewatch to understand. They want to catch what they missed the first time. They want to see if the pattern holds. And every rewatch reinforces the same conclusion. This isn't random. That realization doesn't require proof. It only requires consistency. The internet is ruthless with inconsistency. It exposes it immediately. The fact that this story survives years of scrutiny tells you something important. The behavior aligns. And once alignment is noticed, the audience becomes part of the psychology. They anticipate moments. They expect timing. They watch reactions or the lack of them. That anticipation changes how new moments land. A single joke today carries the weight of every joke before it. That's powerful, because now even silence is interpreted. If nothing happens, people notice. If someone doesn't respond, people remember past silence. The absence of action becomes part of the story, and neither side interrupts that process. They let it happen, because audience-driven narratives are harder to control, but also harder to kill. Once people believe they have discovered a pattern themselves, they hold on to it. That belief becomes personal. It's no longer about defending a celebrity. It's about defending their own interpretation. And that's why this dynamic never fades. It's constantly being reassembled in the minds of viewers. 50 Cent doesn't need to repeat himself. The audience does it for him. Diddy doesn't need to shut anything down. Time does it for him. And in between those two forces, the story stays alive. This is where psychology becomes collective. Not about intention, but about perception. Not about truth, but about meaning. And meaning doesn't require confirmation to exist. It only requires attention. As long as people keep watching, replaying, and noticing, this dynamic continues without either side ever saying another word. Because at this stage, the psychology is no longer just theirs. It's shared. And shared psychology is far more powerful than any single statement could ever be. At this point, it becomes clear why this dynamic never reaches a breaking point. Because breaking points require decisions, and neither side is interested in making one. Psychologically, this is where balance matters more than victory. If one side escalates, they lose control of the narrative. If one side retreats, they lose position. So both choose something else. They hold. Holding is underrated. Holding tension without releasing it requires confidence. It requires knowing that time is working for you, not against you. 50 Cent doesn't need resolution. Resolution would end the conversation. Diddy doesn't need confrontation. Confrontation would invite scrutiny. So the dynamic stays suspended, not because it's unresolved, but because it's optimized. Optimized for influence. Optimized for stability. That's a psychological sweet spot. Most conflicts fail because one side wants closure more than the other. Here, neither does, and that's rare. You can see it in how carefully both sides avoid finality. No statements that close doors. No reactions that force explanations. No moves that can't be walked back. Everything remains flexible. That flexibility is power. It allows both sides to adapt without committing, to move without locking themselves into a position. Psychologically, that's advanced self-regulation. It also explains why observers feel frustrated. People want an ending. They want clarity. They want a winner. But clarity would collapse the balance, and balance is exactly what both sides are protecting. This is why the dynamic feels permanent. It doesn't evolve toward a conclusion. It just continues to exist, like a pressure system that never fully releases. And the longer it lasts, the more intentional it feels. Because accidental dynamics don't survive this long. They either explode or fade away. This did neither. It stayed. That staying power tells you more than any statement ever could. It tells you both sides understand the psychology of loss. Loss isn't always public failure. Sometimes it's losing control. Sometimes it's losing mystery. Sometimes it's losing leverage. And neither side is willing to pay that price. So they remain exactly where they are. One applying light pressure through humor and timing, the other absorbing it through silence and position. Neither moving too far, neither backing down. Just enough tension to keep everything in place. This isn't avoidance, it's discipline. And discipline is the clearest sign that what you're watching isn't random behavior. It's sustained psychological control on both sides. Which is why this dynamic doesn't need new moments to stay alive. It survives on memory, on expectation, on the understanding that something is happening, even when nothing seems to be happening at all. And that's the kind of psychology that doesn't end with a headline. It just keeps existing, quietly. When you step back and look at everything together, the psychology becomes impossible to ignore. This was never about winning, and it was never about exposure. It was about positioning. Two men, two mindsets, two completely different ways of holding power. One uses movement, the other uses stillness. One shapes conversation, the other controls space, and neither ever steps outside of what they understand best. That's why this dynamic never collapses. Because collapse only happens when someone misreads the situation. That never happens here. 50 Cent never confuses influence with control. Diddy never confuses control with popularity. They know exactly what game they're playing. And more importantly, they know what game they're not playing. This is why you don't get emotional speeches, why you don't get clarifications, why you don't get endings. Endings are dangerous. Endings force accountability. They force explanations. They force people to choose sides. Psychologically, endings cost too much. So instead, both sides choose continuation, a state where nothing is fully said, nothing is fully denied, and nothing is fully resolved. That space protects them. It protects reputation, it protects leverage, it protects flexibility, and that's the real takeaway. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the ability to never be forced into a position. 50 Cent's psychology shows you how influence works in public, how humor, timing, and restraint can shape perception without ownership. Diddy's psychology shows you how control works in silence, how distance, consistency, and non-response preserve authority without explanation. Neither approach is accidental, neither is emotional. They're calculated. And when calculated minds interact, you don't get chaos, you get equilibrium. That's why this never turns into a headline moment that ends everything. Because ending everything would mean losing something. And psychologically, both sides are protecting exactly what they value most. So if you're waiting for a final moment, a confrontation, a confession, a clear answer, you'll keep waiting. Because the psychology here doesn't lead to closure. It leads to stability. A stability built on restraint, awareness, and mutual understanding of power. That's why this dynamic has lasted years without breaking. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything that needs to happen is already happening. Quietly, consistently, and exactly within the boundaries both sides understand. And once you see it that way, the story stops being confusing. It becomes clear, not as a feud, not as drama, but as a psychological balance that neither side has any reason to destroy. Because sometimes the strongest move isn't to speak, or to respond, or to escalate. Sometimes the strongest move is knowing exactly where to stop and never crossing that line.